The cowboy saw the woman hanging laundry and found the home he'd been missing. Under the fading Montana sun, a weary cowboy rode through the dust, searching for something he couldn't name. By a small cabin, a woman hung laundry, her children laughing in the wind. When their eyes met, time seemed to still. He stayed to help fixing fences, sharing meals, and little by little, the silence of their hearts turned into peace. But peace is fragile in the Wild West. Greed came riding on dark horses, and fire tested what love had built. Yet through smoke and fear, they held to each other, finding courage in belonging. When dawn rose over the wide plains, the cowboy knew at last home wasn't the trail behind him, but the family waiting by the firelight. In the golden haze of a Montana sunset, a lone man urged his horse across the dusty plain. 6 months on the trail had left his eyes shadowed with sorrow, his dark Stetson hat hiding a sunburned face. They called him Xavier Cole, a man who had survived war, now carrying nothing but silence and the deep scars buried in his soul. In the distance, a thin curl of blue smoke rose from the roof of a small cabin. Beneath an old oak tree, a young woman was pinning a white sheet to the clothesline. Catherine Ward, a widow with 2 small children, had learned how to survive in this unforgiving frontier. She lived by her steady hands, her strong heart, and the memory of the husband she had lost. When their eyes met, both froze as if the whole world had gone still. He lowered his head, his voice rough and low. "Ma'am, may I water my horse?" She nodded gently, her tone calm but soft. "The well's out back." It was a simple exchange, just a few words carried by the wind. But from that moment, the fates of 2 lonely souls quietly changed direction. In the hush of the evening light, Xavier realized what he had been searching for all along. Not a new frontier, but the warmth of a home. Chapter 1. Dinner by the Lamplight. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the wooden walls, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp earth after a late afternoon rain. Inside the small cabin, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting trembling waves of light across the walls like the slow breathing of something alive. Catherine set down the cast-iron pot. The aroma of stew and cornbread drifted gently through the room, filling the silence that had long lived there. Xavier sat across from her calloused hands, resting on his knees. His leather coat was worn at the shoulders, boots coated in red trail dust. He bowed his head slightly, murmured a quiet thanks before taking the bowl she offered. The glow of the oil lamp flickered in his eyes, a warm golden light that seemed to thaw something deep within him. The 2 children, James and Elizabeth, sat beside their mother. The boy stared curiously at the Colt holster on the stranger's hip, while his little sister clutched her wooden doll close. Catherine leaned slightly toward them, her voice gentle but firm. "Eat, children. Don't stare." Xavier smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered face. He nodded to the children, then said quietly, "I used to have a younger brother. About your boy's age." His voice was rough and low, like wind sweeping across the desert. No one asked more, but the silence that followed carried understanding. This man had lost more than he cared to speak of. Catherine ladled another serving of stew, setting it before him. "How long have you been on the road?" she asked. 6 months, maybe more," he replied, eyes fixed on the flames. "I used to scout for the army. When the war ended, there wasn't anything left to go back to. I just kept riding, until I couldn't anymore." A quiet moment passed. Not awkward, not heavy, just the kind of silence shared by those who understand weariness without needing words. Catherine looked at his rough hands and felt an unexpected calm, not fear. Not of a dangerous man, but of someone who had simply run out of places to rest. James broke the stillness with a question full of innocence. "Are you good at riding horses?" "Good enough," Xavier said with a faint grin. "But I've learned to keep them from fearing the dark." The boy's eyes widened. Catherine smiled for the first time that evening. The lamplight flickered with the wind brushing her face with a softness she hadn't felt in years. For so long, this house had known only creaks and wind. Now it held a low, steady voice that felt strangely like home. Dinner ended in quiet peace. Catherine gathered the dishes, and Xavier rose, murmuring, "Thank you for the meal. I'll be on my way come morning." She looked up, the light catching in her eyes. After a pause, she said softly, almost like a sigh, "If you wish, you may stay another night. The wind's cold tonight." He nodded, no words needed. Later, when the lamp was dimmed and only embers glowed red in the hearth, Xavier sat by the window, gazing out across the fields. The moon hung low over the distant hills. For the first time in years, his heart felt still. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had become a place of refuge for two souls weathered by storms. Under the oil lamp's fading light, no promises were spoken yet in every slow breath they shared. Both somehow knew perhaps this was where every journey was meant to end. Chapter 2. The Man Who Stayed at Dawn. The first sunlight crept over the distant hills, glistening on the dew still clinging to the grass roof. The wind swept in from the prairie cold clean and carrying the scent of damp soil. Amid that hush of early morning came the steady rhythm of an axe striking wood, sharp, certain, and alive. Xavier was splitting logs behind the house. Each swing of the axe seemed to cut not only through the timber, but through the long silence of his wandering years. Sweat traced down his sunburned shoulders, his face calm, almost peaceful, as though in this labor he had found a way to breathe again. Catherine stepped out, her apron dusted with flour. She stopped on the porch, watching the stranger work, then said softly, "You don't have to do that. I only offered you a bed for the night." Xavier lowered the axe, a faint smile crossing his tired face. "I know, but I owe you for that fine supper. Figured I'd pay back a little kindness." Catherine hesitated, then said nothing more. She stepped down the porch and looked at the neatly stacked pile of wood. For a fleeting moment, she realized it had been a long time since a man's shadow had moved across this yard. Every heavy task had been hers alone, until this morning when someone quietly shared the burden. James came running out, tugging on Xavier's sleeve. "Do you know how to fix fences? Let's find out." Xavier chuckled, grabbing a hammer from the post. Together they worked on the broken fence left from last winter while Elizabeth sat nearby, swinging her legs and humming a tune. From the kitchen window, Catherine watched them, her heart softening as her daughter's laughter rang through the yard. There was something strange about this man. He didn't talk much, didn't try to impress anyone yet. His presence filled the quiet house with warmth. By noon, the smell of smoked meat drifted through the air. Catherine brought out water, setting it on the worn wooden table. "You should rest a bit." Xavier wiped his brow, accepted the cup. "Thank you. I think I'd forgotten what it feels like to work for someone else, not just for myself." Catherine tilted her head, smiling faintly. "Funny. I'd forgotten what it feels like to have someone here." The words passed between them like a soft breeze, and in that shared glance lay something unnamed, a quiet, tender kind of peace. That afternoon, Xavier led his horse down to the creek. James followed, peppering him with questions about the places he'd seen: Texas, Arizona, dusty towns, and faraway mountains. Xavier answered sparingly, his voice slow and steady, as if each story carried the weight of memories too old to disturb. "There are good folks and bad ones everywhere, James. What matters is knowing where you belong. And you, mister, where do you belong?" Xavier fell silent. The wind rustled through the tall grass. He looked toward the horizon where the trail disappeared into a haze of light. "I'm not sure yet," he said quietly. That evening, while Catherine set the table, Xavier stacked the dry wood beside the hearth. The children chattered about their day, and Catherine listened, sometimes laughing, a sound that had been missing from the house for far too long. It wasn't forced or fleeting. It was real. After dinner, Xavier sat on the porch, sharpening the axe blade. Catherine stood in the doorway, a towel still in her hands. "Are you really leaving in the morning?" she asked. He looked up, the lamplight glinting in his bronze-colored eyes. "I don't know. Maybe I'll stay a few more days. The barn roof still leaks and that fence could use more work." Catherine smiled softly. "Stay then. Just don't work yourself to exhaustion." "I'm not tired," he said, gazing out at the darkened fields. "When my hands can still work, I feel useful." The words caught Catherine off guard. In the chill that slipped through the cracks of the door, she realized this man wasn't just mending her fences or patching her roof. He was mending something inside himself. Night fell, and a pale crescent moon climbed above the hills. Outside, the wind brushed against the new fence, creaking gently like the heartbeat of a house coming back to life. Catherine extinguished the lamp, looking out the window. Xavier's shadow lingered on the porch, steady, patient. In that moment, she knew he wouldn't be leaving in the morning, and perhaps deep down she didn't want him to. The night wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Out here at the edge of the Wild West, among all its loneliness and endless sky, two wandering souls had begun to find each other. Not through words, but through quiet presence and shared warmth. Xavier watched the fire fade in the hearth, a faint smile on his lips. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a passerby. He was staying within a home beside a strong woman, and with two bright-eyed children. And within him stirred something gentle yet enduring like wind through old timber, the feeling of being needed, of belonging, and of being alive again. Chapter 3. Seeds of Love in the Wind. Summer came quietly to Montana. The wind was no longer biting like in March. It softened, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and sun-dried pine. The days grew longer. Sunlight spilled lazily over the wooden fences, glinting off Catherine's brown hair as she hung the wash. Somewhere behind her, the steady rhythm of hammer and nail filled the air, calm, sure, alive. Xavier had stayed. He never said why, and Catherine never asked. Everything between them unfolded naturally, as if his presence had always been meant to be. Each morning he rose before the rooster, checking the hay in the stable, teaching James how to rake the dry grass evenly. Little Elizabeth followed close behind, clutching the wooden horse he had carved for her the night before, humming a song only she seemed to know. From the window, Catherine watched, her heart stuttering for just a moment. Xavier knelt in the yard, holding her late husband's old hunting rifle, showing James how to clean the barrel, how to set the safety, how to respect a weapon that could take a life or save one. His voice was deep and calm. A gun's only as good as the man who knows when to stop using it. James nodded solemnly, his young face serious. Catherine couldn't help but smile, and realized with surprise that it had been a long time since she had smiled at all. That afternoon, Xavier climbed onto the roof to patch the leaking henhouse. When Catherine brought out water, he was shirtless under the sun, his back slick with sweat muscles moving with quiet rhythm. His skin was tanned bronze, rough but steady. She set the jug down, saying softly, "You work like someone who's done this all his life." He looked up, smiling faintly. "Where there's work to be done, that's where I belong." A simple line, yet it stirred something deep in her chest. That night, after the children were asleep, Catherine carried a blanket out to the porch. The moon hung low over the oak trees, and the wind moved softly through the grass. Xavier sat on the steps, turning his hat in his hands, staring into the distance. She placed the blanket beside him and asked quietly, "You're not sleeping? I'm used to keeping watch. Nights like this make a man think." She smiled and sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the whisper of crickets and wind brushing the porch. Then Catherine spoke, her voice barely more than a breath. "You know, my husband's been gone 3 years now. That winter was cold, too cold. He took a fever, and by the time I found a doctor, it was too late." She paused, staring down at her hands. "Since then, I stopped believing anyone would stay. Everyone leaves one way or another." Xavier said nothing. He didn't reach for her or offer comfort. He simply listened, letting her words drift into the wind. After a long while, he spoke, voice low and steady. "I understand. You've lost someone too." He nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "Many. In the war, I learned to forget their faces, but at night, I still hear them calling. And that's when I realized the cruelest thing isn't losing people. It's surviving them and not knowing what you're living for anymore." Catherine turned toward him. The moonlight traced the lines of his scarred face, the quiet sorrow beneath his strength. "And now, have you found your answer?" He smiled. Short, honest. "Maybe I'm finding it here." They sat together for a long time, saying nothing. The wind carried the scent of hay and wood smoke, and warmth began to settle gently between them, the kind that needed no words. That night, Catherine lay awake. She heard his footsteps outside, checking the horses, making sure all was well. The steady rhythm of his movement filled the house with something it had been missing: the sound of a man's presence. For the first time in years, she felt safe. When dawn broke, dew clung to the fence posts. Catherine opened the door to find Xavier sitting by the fire pit, sharpening a small knife, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. He looked up and smiled, and in that moment her heart skipped, not fast, not wildly, just one quiet, certain beat that told her it was alive again. Love's seed often grows from such small things: a glance that lingers, a word spoken softly, the steady presence of someone who makes the world less cold. Xavier didn't realize that every act, when he mended the fence, lifted Elizabeth into his arms, or taught James to tie a saddle, was planting something warm and tender in Catherine's heart. Nor did he know that her shy smiles, the way she set his coffee beside him each morning, were slowly stitching the torn edges of his soul. In this wild land where people survived on caution and fear, they had found each other through simplicity, not promises or declarations, but through the wind brushing the porch and the quiet rhythm of shared breath. And from that night on, whenever the wind passed through the fields, Catherine no longer felt its chill. For within its whisper she could hear the steady breath of the man who stayed soft, deep, and as real as life itself. Chapter 4. Strangers on Horseback. That afternoon the sun burned harshly and the wind was dry as ash. The western sky glowed red, and dust rose from the distant trail, curling like smoke in the heat. Catherine was hanging laundry beneath the old oak tree, her children playing nearby. Their laughter rang clear through the wind, bright, peaceful, unguarded. Then Elizabeth suddenly looked up, her small voice breaking the calm. "Mama, someone's coming." Catherine shaded her eyes toward the dirt road. 3 dark shapes emerged on the horizon, growing larger with every pounding hoofbeat. The wind carried the sound closer, along with clouds of dust. As the riders drew near, her stomach tightened. The man in front, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a long cattle-hide coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over half his face, was Frank Byers. She knew that name too well. Owner of the Circle B Ranch, rich, ruthless, and convinced that anyone poorer than him was a fool ready to sell. He had come here twice before, each time with what he called an offer, though it always sounded more like a threat. From the barn, Xavier heard the horses and came out at once. He stepped onto the porch between Catherine and the red-dusted road, tall, steady, one hand resting loosely on the colt at his hip. His eyes were calm but sharp, cold as steel newly honed. The 3 riders stopped in the yard. Byers looked up, the sunlight glinting off his thick black beard. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ward," he drawled, voice low and oily. "I came to finish our little conversation." Catherine swallowed, forcing her tone steady. "I already gave you my answer, Mr. Byers. I'm not selling." Byers smirked. "You might want to think again. Your land sits right by the East Creek, and that water runs straight through my property. No one likes trouble over boundaries, do they?" Before Catherine could reply, Xavier stepped forward. Voice even, but firm. The lady said, "No, I suggest you respect that." The men behind Byers shifted in their saddles, sunlight flashing off their gunmetal. Byers' smirk faltered and his gaze fixed on Xavier. "And who are you, huh? Some drifter lucky enough to be fed by a lonely widow." The insult hung in the air, thick as the dust around them. Xavier didn't flinch. "I'm the man standing between you and someone you ought not threaten." The silence that followed stretched taut as a drawn bow. Wind stirred the dust around their boots. Xavier's coat flapped lightly in the gust. Catherine felt her pulse quicken. Fear mingled with something else. In his eyes she saw not rage, but the calm of a man who had already looked death in the face and learned not to fear it. Byers snorted, scanning the modest cabin behind her. "No threats here, ma'am. Just a friendly offer. But you should remember, winters in Montana are long and cold. Hard to survive out here, a woman alone with 2 children." Catherine's grip tightened on her apron. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. "I've survived 3 winters already, Mr. Byers. I'll survive more. You needn't worry about me." Xavier's hand brushed his holster, his tone dropping low. "You heard her. Leave." The wind howled through the silence that followed. A horse snorted, metal clinked. Byers stared at Xavier for a long moment, his smile fading into something hard and mean. "Careful, friend. This land is wide and wild. A man could disappear out here and no one would ever know." Xavier stepped closer, his shadow cutting long across the dirt. "I survived a war. If you want to find out how, go ahead." For a heartbeat, the 2 men locked eyes, the veteran and the tyrant, the air between them humming with unspoken violence. Then Byers exhaled sharply and forced a laugh. "No need for that. I'm just a businessman." He tugged on his reins, turning his horse. "Think about what I said, Mrs. Ward. When winter comes, that land won't be worth near as much." He gestured to his men. The 3 riders turned, hooves thudding against the packed dirt, raising another storm of dust as they rode away. Catherine stood still, her hands gripping her skirt. When the haze settled, only the echo of hooves and the faint scent of gun oil lingered in the air. Xavier relaxed his shoulders and stepped off the porch. His voice was calm, certain. "He'll be back." Catherine nodded, eyes dark with worry. "I know. He wants the creek. If not today, then someday." Xavier looked at her and his gaze softened. "Don't worry, I'll be here." She nodded again, saying nothing, but in her eyes was a quiet trust, stronger than words. That night, Catherine sat by the window watching as Xavier led the horses into the new stable. The oil lamp cast a faint gold light over his shoulders, painting him in shades of strength and silence. And in that moment, she understood he wasn't just a passerby in her life. He had chosen to stay to protect this place, this family, this fragile piece of peace. Sometimes she realized a person doesn't need a vow or a promise. Sometimes all it takes is someone standing between you and the danger, and that's enough to believe in. Outside, the dust settled on the quiet road, but the air still carried the breath of threat. Byers was gone, yet his last look lingered, sharp, cold, and waiting. Inside the little cabin beneath the hill, a man sat silently on the porch gun, resting across his knees. And for the first time, the woman inside no longer felt alone beneath the endless Wild West sky. Chapter 5. The Fire in the Night. The winter wind howled across the prairie, sharp as a blade. The night was thick and black, the only light spilling from the oil lamp inside the cabin. Catherine had just lulled Elizabeth to sleep. James lay dozing by the hearth. Everything was still, that fragile stillness one only recognizes when it's about to be shattered. Outside, Xavier was still awake. He checked the stable, added straw to the stalls, and patted the old mare's back a wordless goodnight. As he turned toward the house, he paused, sensing something odd in the air. There was a smell, faint but familiar. Kerosene. Then a shrill neigh ripped through the dark. Catherine bolted upright, heart lurching. Through the window, a burst of red light flared against the night. Fire. The barn was ablaze, flames devouring the dry timber in seconds. "Xavier," she screamed, wrapping herself in a coat and rushing outside. He was already there, running headlong into the inferno. Smoke and sparks swirled around him, the fire's glow painting his face in crimson. Horses shrieked and kicked within the blaze. The air burned thick and bitter. Catherine saw his shadow vanish into the smoke, heard the crash of a door, then the sound of hooves bursting free one by one. "Get out of there!" she cried, tears streaming down her ash-streaked cheeks. A sharp crack echoed as part of the roof collapsed. For a moment her world stopped, and then through the haze he appeared. Covered in soot shirt, torn, dragging the last horse out of the flames before falling to his knees. Catherine ran to him, pulling him close. "God, Xavier, are you hurt?" He coughed, then smiled weakly. "I'm fine. They're all safe." The fire roared behind them, swallowing the barn whole. They stood together hand in hand, watching everything they'd built, their labor, their shelter, their sense of safety crumble into glowing ash. The wind carried sparks into the night like the wings of dying birds. After a long silence, Xavier spoke, voice rough and heavy. "This wasn't an accident. I smelled oil before the flames. Catherine turned to him, the firelight reflected in her steady, determined eyes. Buyers. He nodded once. He wants to scare you. Make us leave, sell out. Catherine gripped his hand tighter, her nails digging into his smoke-stained skin. The flames flickered in her eyes, casting his face scarred and strong in a light both fierce and sacred. We're not leaving, she said, her voice like iron. Not for him, not for anyone. Xavier held her gaze, then nodded slowly. No one will take this land, or what we're building here. The wind swept around them, stoking the fire's last embers. The glow danced in their eyes, two reflections of a single unspoken vow. From the doorway, James called out, his face pale. Mama the barn. It's all right, sweetheart, Catherine whispered, pulling him close. Your father saved them. The words slipped out without thought, your father. Soft as breath, yet powerful enough to stop them both cold. Xavier looked at her, and she at him, their eyes meeting through the haze. His expression gentled not from the fire outside, but from the one burning quietly within a sense of belonging. By dawn, only smoldering ashes and cold smoke remained. The barn was gone, but the earth still stood, and so did they. Side by side, they stamped out the last embers, their fingers intertwined in the misty morning air. Ahead lay lost danger and a battle not yet over. But in that pale light of a new day, Catherine knew one truth the fire had not just destroyed, it had forged something new. The blaze outside had died, but within them another flame burned on the fire of faith, of love, and of a will unbroken beneath the wild, relentless sky. Chapter 6. Where the Heart Finds Home. The night after the fire, the wind still howled across the plains, sharp and bitter, carrying the scent of smoke and smoldering ash. The barn stood in ruins, only a blackened frame left still warm from the flames. Xavier hadn't slept. He sat on the porch staring at the scorched earth, his hand resting on the worn grip of his old revolver. Catherine stepped out, a thin wool blanket draped around her shoulders. The pale moonlight shimmered on her hair, softening the weariness etched across her face. She placed a steaming cup of tea beside him, the scent rising into the cold air. You haven't slept. Can't not when the ground's still burning, he replied, voice low and rough. She sat down beside him. Together they gazed at the blackened patch of land in silence. After a long moment, she spoke, her tone barely above a whisper. I've grown used to taking care of myself. But when I saw you run into the fire, I was scared. Xavier turned toward her, the moon reflected in his eyes like light over deep water. I only did what any man should have done. No. She shook her head, her voice catching. No one else would have. The wind sighed through the bare oak branches, the hoot of an owl echoing from afar. The world felt suspended, two people sitting side by side, close enough to share warmth, yet barely touching. Xavier looked at her hands resting on her knees, thin, roughened by years of work, and thought they were the most beautiful hands he had ever seen. Catherine. He began softly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile quiet between them. I've wandered half my life, town after town, road after road, and never once did I find a place I wanted to stop. Until that day, I saw you hanging a white sheet under the oak, your children running in the grass. I don't know what to call that feeling. I just know that for the first time, I wanted to stay. Catherine trembled, not from the cold. She looked down, silent for a long time, then whispered, You don't understand. I lost the man I loved, lost him to a winter so cruel I thought my heart froze with him. I'm not sure I could survive losing someone again. Xavier said nothing. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze was something gentler than pity, something steady, human. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing hers. I can't promise there won't be storms, Catherine, but if you'll let me, I'll walk through every one of them with you. I don't want to be a guest in your home or a stranger passing by. I want to belong here to you and to those children. She lifted her eyes to him. What she saw there wasn't the restlessness of a drifter, it was peace, the quiet certainty of a man who had finally found his home. The wind was still cold, but warmth bloomed within her chest. She drew a breath, speaking softly, every word trembling like a leaf. "Stay." Xavier frowned, confused for a moment. "In the barn I can fix up the loft." She shook her head, a faint smile curving her lips. "Not in the barn. Stay. With us." 4 small words, lighter than a breath, yet enough to lift the weight of years off his shoulders. Xavier took her hand, holding it tightly, his own hand warm and trembling. "I'll stay. Not just for this winter, but for all the ones after." A gust of wind swept through, carrying the scent of ash and pine. But beneath the porch's dim light, 2 souls sat close wrapped, not in blankets, but in something stronger trust. Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder. Far off, a rooster crowed early. Inside, the slow, even breaths of 2 sleeping children filled the quiet night. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Between them, something new had begun, like a green shoot pushing through the ashes after a fire. From that night on, both their hearts had a home. And at the far edge of the wild, unforgiving West, love had found its simplest, truest shape, one who chose to stay, and one who finally stopped being afraid to lose. Chapter 7. A Western Wedding. Spring morning draped Montana in a new coat. Snow had melted, streams whispered through the grasslands, and the wind carried the scent of wet soil and newborn grass. Along the dirt road leading to the small town, a wagon rolled slowly, wheels creaking through the soft mud, leaving long, uneven tracks behind. Inside, Catherine held tightly to a bouquet of wildflowers she'd gathered by the roadside yellow daisies, and a few sprigs of lavender, simple yet pure. Beside her sat Xavier, silent as ever, dressed in a freshly pressed white shirt, his sleeves faintly smelling of soap. He spoke little, but in his eyes glowed something steady, a quiet faith, as solid as the earth beneath them. The church came into view ahead, small and humble, nestled between 2 rows of pine trees. The bell had not yet rung, but the wind moving through the wooden eaves seemed to whisper its own blessing. Outside the chapel stood a handful of townsfolk, familiar faces, some curious, some kind, some murmuring behind their hands. As Catherine stepped down from the wagon, she caught fragments of whispers behind her. The widow Ward's really marrying that drifter. Guess she needs a hired hand more than a husband. She heard it all, but only smiled faintly. She had survived winters harsher than gossip. She didn't need their approval, only the hand that now held hers firm and sure. Xavier leaned closer, voice low and meant only for her. "Let them talk. Today it's just us." Inside, colored lights streamed through stained glass windows, falling across the wooden floor, where the old pastor stood waiting. His eyes were kind as he began to speak the vows, slow and steady. Catherine could hear her heartbeat keeping pace with his words. Everything else faded, the murmurs, the walls, the world, until there was only Xavier's face before her, tanned, peaceful, and so painfully sincere. The pastor's voice rang out, "Xavier, Cole, do you promise to stand by her through ease and hardship for all your days?" Xavier's grip tightened around her hand, his eyes unflinching. "I do, and I swear, I will never leave again." His words were deep and warm, a note that struck straight into her soul. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, not of sorrow, but of release. After so many years of fear and loss, her heart finally dared to believe again. When the pastor said, "You are husband and wife," Catherine looked up at him. There was no gold ring, only a strip of worn leather he looped around her finger, rough, simple, but impossibly warm. Outside, the children cheered. "Mama, does that mean Mr. Xavier's our pa now?" Laughter burst from everyone, Catherine included. Her smile shone like sunlight breaking through after a long winter, melting every shadow that had ever touched her face. On the road back, Catherine sat beside him in the wagon, her plain white dress fluttering in the wind. James sat behind with Elizabeth, their giggles filling the open plains. The laughter of children mingled with the steady roll of the wheels, a sound Xavier knew he would never forget. When they reached home, Catherine opened the door. Spring air swept through, bringing the scent of smoke, earth, and life itself. Xavier paused at the threshold, eyes tracing the humble cabin that had become his haven. He whispered half to himself, "Now I have a place to come back to." Catherine turned, smiling softly. Not just a place to come back to, Xavier. A home, our home. As dusk settled, sunlight spilled gold across the roof, glinting like threads of promise. Inside, the sound of laughter and the chime of a wind bell danced together. In the wild vastness of the West, a land of loss and solitude, two wandering souls had at last found a home. Not through fate, but through courage, the courage to love again. Chapter 8, The Game of Power. That summer came to Montana wrapped in scorching sunlight and dry winds that swept red dust from the trails. After the barn fire, life had slowly settled back into a fragile peace. Catherine tended the garden. James learned to ride. Elizabeth practiced her first letters. Xavier mended the roof, built a new stable. Everything looked like the beginning of something good. But peace on the prairie never lasted long. One morning, as Catherine was hanging laundry, a rider appeared on the horizon, carrying an envelope sealed in red wax, the emblem of the Helena court. Inside was a summons. Frank Byers had filed a lawsuit claiming the ward's land extended illegally into the Circle B ranch. Catherine read the letter twice, her hands trembling, then looked to Xavier. He took the paper silently, his face hard as stone. "He's trying to take your land the proper way now," he said, voice steady but tight. "That's how men like him work. They know the law, but not what's right." Catherine sighed. "All I have are the old papers my husband signed before he passed." Xavier folded the document neatly and set it on the table. "Then we'll find another way." But Byers wasn't done hiding behind the law. He used force, too. One afternoon, while Xavier was riding back from town with nails and oil, he was ambushed near the creek bend. 3 men stepped out from the brush. No words, just gunfire. By the time he was brought home, his shirt was torn and his shoulder soaked in blood. Catherine's breath caught as she helped him onto the bed. "My God, what did they do to you?" He coughed, forcing a faint grin. "Not they. Him. Byers doesn't just want the land. He wants us scared enough to leave." Catherine bit her lip until she tasted blood. Fear rose like old smoke, but this time it didn't make her shrink. She looked at the man before her, the one who had run into fire for her family, and in his eyes she saw the same steel she felt awakening in her own. 3 days later, Xavier was still too weak to ride, so Catherine decided to go to Helena alone. She tied back her hair, pulled on a long coat, and packed the faded papers that were all she had left of Henry's estate. James caught her hand. "Mama, let me go with you." "No, sweetheart. Stay and look after your sister. I'll be home soon." Her smile was gentle, but her eyes were fierce, filled with a resolve even she hadn't known she possessed. The road to Helena was long and dust-choked, but Catherine rode on without faltering. When she reached the old land surveyor's office, she found a gray-haired man behind the desk, voice gravelly from age and disuse. "Mrs. Ward, I remember your husband worked with a surveyor. John Davis, wasn't it?" "Yes," Catherine said. "I need any records from his survey. Anything that can prove my land's boundary is legitimate." The man dug through a pile of worn ledgers before pulling out a weathered brown leather journal. "This is Davis's field book. He recorded every tract he mapped. No one's asked for it in 10 years. Catherine opened it with trembling fingers. On the 3rd page in faded ink were the words, "Land of Henry Ward, 10 acres south of the Great Creek, marked by the Twin Oaks." Her breath caught. Those Twin Oaks still stood right behind her house, where James loved to climb in the afternoons. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the journal as if it were gold. By dusk, she returned home. Xavier sat on the porch, his arms still bound in bandages, his face pale but brightening when he saw her. "You found something." Catherine set the book on the table. "Proof, the surveyor's log. They can't take our land now." Xavier stared at her, then smiled, proud and relieved. "You did what I couldn't." Catherine shook her head. "No, we did it. You taught me not to fear. I just learned that sometimes battles aren't fought with guns." Outside, the wind rolled over the plains, lifting red dust into the setting sun. Far off, the cattle trudged home beneath a sky painted gold, and in the small cabin by the hill, Catherine Ward, once thought fragile, stood tall, eyes bright with conviction, holding in her hands the truth that would change everything. The power games of Frank Byers were coming to an end, and this time, Catherine wasn't the one being protected. She was the one protecting home. Chapter 9. The Trial. In Helena. That morning, Helena awoke beneath a veil of pale mist. The church bells tolled in the distance, mingling with the rumble of wagon wheels on cobblestone. Outside the county courthouse, a crowd had gathered townsfolk, curious farmers and a few ranchers eager to witness the clash between Catherine Ward, the widowed homesteader, and Frank Byers, the most powerful land baron in Montana. Catherine stepped down from the small carriage, clutching the worn brown leather journal, the surveyor's log that held her last hope. Beside her walked Xavier, his left shoulder still bandaged, but his gaze sharp and unwavering. He carried no gun today, only honor and faith that truth still held value in a land where property was often bought with sweat and blood. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Byers sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a black coat hat resting on the table, his lips curled in a smug smile. His lawyer, a thin man with polished spectacles, rose to begin. "Your Honor, it's clear that Mrs. Ward's property overlaps with the eastern boundary of the Circle B Ranch. We have the most recent map from last year's survey to prove it." Xavier's hand found Catherine's under the table, a quiet reassurance. She took a deep breath, then stood, her voice steady as a mountain stream. "That map was commissioned and paid for by Mr. Byers himself. But I have here the original surveyor's journal written by John Davis, who first marked these lands 10 years ago." She stepped forward and placed the aged notebook on the judge's desk. Its yellowed pages trembled as they opened to a line written in faded inkland of Henry Ward, 10 acres south of the Great Creek boundary marked by the Twin Oaks. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Heads turned toward Byers. His jaw tightened. His gloved hands gripped the brim of his hat. "An old notebook isn't legal proof," his lawyer objected. The judge looked up, calm but firm. "If the signature of John Davis is verified by the survey office, it can be." Without a word, Catherine withdrew another paper, the official confirmation she'd obtained from the records clerk, bearing a fresh red seal. The room fell silent. Byers shot to his feet, voice sharp with anger. She bribed them. What would a widow know about the law anyway? Xavier stood too, not shouting, but his voice carried clear through the room. "She knows about justice, something you never learned." The judge's gavel struck once. "Order." After a tense pause, he reviewed the papers, then looked up. "Based on the presented evidence, the property of Mrs. Catherine Ward is lawfully owned and does not infringe upon the boundaries of the Circle B Ranch. The plaintiff's case is dismissed." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came a rustle of whispers, the scrape of chairs. Byers slammed his palm against the table, his face red with rage, but there was nothing left to say. Catherine met his glare with a calm, final look, not vengeful, only resolute. She stepped forward, speaking clearly enough for all to hear. "This land is the soul of my family. My husband bled to keep it, and now I stand for it, not for the soil itself, but for the honor of those who lived and died here." A hush fell. Then somewhere in the back, an elderly woman began to clap, slow, deliberate. Others followed until the sound filled the hall. Byers snatched his hat, storming out into the sunlight. Outside, the wind caught the dust, swirling it down the street as his horse's hooves faded into the distance. Catherine stood still, her heart pounding yet light. Xavier turned to her and murmured, "You did it." She smiled, eyes glistening. "We did it." When they stepped out of the courthouse, the sun had risen high, flooding the narrow streets with gold. Light glinted off the windows and caught in Catherine's hair like fire. Somewhere nearby, the church bells rang again, not in judgment, but in celebration. Xavier reached for her hand and she took it. Together, they walked down the courthouse steps, out of the shadow of conflict, into the bright open air. Montana stretched wide and untamed before them, still harsh, still wild, but for the first time in years the storm had passed. On the ride home, Catherine gazed toward the rolling green fields that kissed the horizon. "At last we can live in peace," she whispered. Xavier nodded, a soft smile breaking across his face. "Yes, peace not because we won, but because we kept what truly matters: a piece of land, a home, and the honor of those who never bowed." Chapter 10. The House on the Green Hill. Spring came late that year in Montana. Snow melted slowly, drop by drop, from the eaves, blending with the sound of hammers, saws, and wood striking wood on the high hill. There, amid endless young grass and wind, a new house was taking shape. It wasn't a grand house, but it was solid. The foundation was built from river stones, the frame from pine beams that Xavier had chosen one by one. Every post, every joint was soaked with sweat and pride. He worked tirelessly while Catherine brought him tea and bread every afternoon, watching in silence as he labored beneath the sun, hair tousled by the wind eyes gleaming with quiet joy. One morning, as they stood on the half-finished frame, Catherine rested a hand on her belly. A tender, almost trembling smile crossed her lips. "Xavier, there's something I need to tell you." He looked up, squinting against the sunlight, and when he caught the meaning in her gaze, the hammer slowly slipped from his hand. "You're..." With child Catherine nodded, her voice barely more than a breath. "Yes. By summer there will be another laugh in this house." For a long moment, Xavier said nothing. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that could outshine the morning. He stepped forward, held her close, and placed his rough palms on her stomach, trembling slightly. "Then this house has one more reason to be finished soon." From that day, every strike of his hammer carried something more than strength, it carried purpose. James was given the task of painting the window frames, while Elizabeth planted lavender around the porch. The whole family worked together, their laughter echoing across the valley and into the faraway pine woods. By summer, the house was complete. The pine walls gleamed honey gold beneath the sun. The steep roof was carved with simple care. From the porch, the valley spread wide and green, a river glinting through the birch trees like a ribbon of light. That evening, the four of them stood on the hilltop, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Catherine leaned against Xavier's shoulder, eyes shimmering. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," she whispered. "A real home. A real family." Xavier's hand tightened gently around hers. "I once thought home was just a place to rest, but now I know better." He turned to her, voice low and certain. "Home isn't a place. It's the people in it." The evening wind swept past them, carrying the scent of cut grass, new timber, and life itself. James and Elizabeth chased each other around the fence, their laughter ringing through the air. Catherine touched her belly where a small heartbeat fluttered, and felt her own heart match its rhythm. Night fell softly. Lamplight spilled from the new window, golden warm. Xavier sat on the porch, an old guitar in his hands, strumming a few gentle notes. Catherine leaned on his shoulder, eyes half closed. Inside, the children slept, and the whisper of the creek drifted through the open window. By dawn, the valley was bathed in pale gold. Sunlight touched the wooden roof, slipped through the windows, and fell across four faces. Catherine, Xavier, James, and Elizabeth gathered in the quiet of a new day. Far above, birds crossed the sky, leaving faint streaks of silver in the blue. In that moment, time seemed to stop. No more battles, no more loneliness, no more loss, only a small house on a green hill and four souls bound together by love, faith, and a promise to stay. That sunrise didn't just light the valley, it illuminated the hearts of those who had once been lost, now found. And so the story ended in light, the light of forever. Years drifted gently by. Winters came and went. Fields turned gold each summer. The wooden house on the hill still stood weathered by wind, but with a thin line of blue smoke rising each morning. Catherine had more wrinkles at the corners of her eyes now, but her gaze was as warm as ever. Xavier no longer wandered. His hands were calloused from labor, yet he still played the same old tune at sunset. James had grown tall. Elizabeth still chattered by the window, and their youngest, Samuel, ran barefoot around the porch, carrying within him the peace his parents had spent half their lives fighting for. Over Montana, the western wind still blew dry, fierce, untamed. But through that vastness, the thin trail of smoke from a small cabin rose straight into the sky like a quiet signature of life in a harsh land. It told not just the story of a drifter and a widow, but of every soul that had once been lost and then found another among the wild and endless world. For even in the hardest soil and under the cruelest sun, love and home will always find a way to bloom. If you too believe that everyone deserves a place to belong, hit subscribe and join us for more tales from the Wild West, where lonely hearts find their way back to the light of home, and where amid dust and wind, humanity still finds a place to call its own.